going to talk briefly about the nature of children and about the nature of anxiety. We're going to spend some time looking at the causes of anxiety in children and teenagers. We're going to talk about the general principles of treatment, a Zhang Fu and pathogen perspective of anxiety, and a 5-element perspective of anxiety. And then if we have time at the end, we're going to look at some case histories. So I wanted to start by saying that I know of no better treatment for anxiety in children than acupuncture. It is truly miraculous. And nobody wants our young children and our teenagers to be on medication for many obvious reasons. And talking therapy can be, of real value in teenagers and older children. But actually, for a lot of younger children and even teenagers, talking therapy is just too direct, too threatening, and children and teenagers often don't have the level of insight that they need for talking therapy to be of real value. But by bringing about a state of balance in a child's chi, we can stop them from being anxious. And if we can lessen their anxiety, then their life becomes more enjoyable, they become more functioning, and then as they grow up into adults can become someone who contributes more to the world. So it's really, really valuable work to be helping children and teens who are anxious. And I very much hope that by the end of this webinar, more of you will feel confident and competent to be able to do that. So I just wanted to start with a couple of quotes, which you probably have seen before, that show the importance when we're using acupuncture of addressing our treatment to the level of the spirit. And anxiety at its root is a dysfunction in the child's spirit. And as these quotes show, when we give our attention to the spirit and bring that back to a healthful place, then the body follows. So we need to just hold that in our minds throughout this webinar, and when we're working with children, that when they come for anxiety and anxiety-related issues, we are talking about the spirit and we're talking about the shen. So I want to just make a few points about the nature of children, what distinguishes them from adults, that impact both the way that we treat them, but also that impact the way that they respond to the world. And therefore, this helps us to understand why children become anxious. So the shen of a child is not firmly rooted. The yuan qi is not yet mature, and the shen is not strong and safe and rooted. It's very easily impacted and affected. So any kind of trauma, any kind of strong emotion that's out there in the world is going to impact a child even more than it would an adult. And that goes for teenagers too. The shen of teenagers is still not strong and firmly rooted. So when Lorne mentioned in his introduction the fact that at the moment there is just so much anxiety out in the ether, sadly, it's children who are bearing the brunt of that, because they are like sponges and they are soaking it up without even knowing that they're doing it. And it has a very big impact on their chi. And when a child is knocked by something that goes on in the external world, they're not able to bring themselves back to a place of balance in the way that as adults, hopefully most of the time, we can. So if we imagine that external stimuli, like, for example, a strong emotion or a trauma, is like wind that, wind. So if there's wind, it will make a tree bend, and it'll knock off branches, and it'll cause a lot of kind of movement in its wake. And that's what emotions do in children. But whereas we hope that most of the time a tree can right itself when the wind has passed, children struggle to do that. So when their chi gets knocked off its path, they struggle to come back to a more balanced state. And when that happens, that can lay the way for future anxiety to come in and to take a hold, to take a grip. The heart and the kidney axis is not fully formed in children and teenagers. So this is what will bear the brunt of early life trauma. And by trauma, I don't mean necessarily the sort of obvious things that we know to be traumatic. Well, I do mean those, but not only those. But many, many subtle things can have a traumatic impact on a young child. Things that we may, as adults, not even notice. And that's because the heart and kidney axis isn't fully formed. And the heart and kidney axis is like the linchpin of mental emotional health. It's the kind of core of stability that enables us to withstand everything that happens in our life. And if this balance between the heart and the kidneys is knocked in early childhood, it can hamper the circulation of blood to the other organs. It can weaken the kidneys, and it can also agitate the nervous system. So if we don't correct any imbalance that's come between the heart and the kidneys in children, then again, their foundations of mental health are not solid. And then at some point in the future, when they're going through a difficult time or something major happens in their lives, they do not have that robustness that they need to withstand it and to get through that and to right themselves. And I wanted to just point out a lot of pathologies that tend to appear during adolescence that are often also involved, as we'll see later, in anxiety. So there's an enormous surge of yang qi during adolescence, and this often leads to an excess of heat, which obviously agitates the shen and can be involved in anxiety. A lot of adolescents have an enormous amount of qi stagnation, partly because their desire for independence is greater than the amount of independence that they're being given. So that leads to constraint and stagnation. And also because this surge of yang qi derives from the kidneys, from the water element, which is obviously the mother of the wood element. So it then impacts the wood on the sheng cycle. Spleen qi deficiency, which again, as we'll see, is also a common pattern that appears in anxious children, crops up sometimes for the first time during adolescence, because teenagers suddenly need to eat a huge amount to fuel their accelerated growth. And that, together with the fact that they may not be eating the best food and they may be studying a lot, all comes together and knocks their spleen chi. Blood deficiency very commonly comes up, particularly in teenage girls when they start menstruating. And again, if they're not eating a good diet of lots of blood nourishing foods, if they're over exercising, studying a lot, that all leads commonly to blood deficiency, which is also involved in anxiety. And kidney yin deficiency also crops up often at adolescence, and this largely crops up in teenagers whose lives are overscheduled, who are always on the go and don't have enough downtime when they're able to settle and rest and rebuild their yin. So we need to just bear in mind as we go forward those characteristics of children and teenagers. And now we're going to talk a bit about the nature of anxiety. So the first thing to say about anxiety, which is hugely important, is that anxiety very often shows up as something else. It shows up as a physical symptom. It shows up as a child who appears to be very sad, or a child who appears to be very angry, for example. And at the same time, something else often shows up as anxiety. So anxiety can be a kind of smoke screen. It can be something that a child or a teenager unconsciously chooses to feel rather than confront an emotion that is too uncomfortable or painful for them. So anxiety kind of comes in and takes the place of the true emotion that's within them, but that they're not, for whatever reason, able to connect with and to manage and to live comfortably with. And sometimes it's easier for children and adults, of course, to be anxious than it is to know themselves properly. So when we talk about anxiety, we're actually talking about a very wide-ranging, multifaceted, complex condition. And throughout the webinar, I want to guide you to make sense of this very complex condition, to have really kind of simple and effective ways of recognizing what's really going on and treating it effectively in the clinic with acupuncture. So some common things that anxiety shows up as are sadness, irritability, negativity. All the things on this slide are often how anxiety presents. So for example, you may have a child who comes to the clinic and their parents say they just fly off the handle all the time. They're really angry. You know, they're like a volcano. And you start talking to the child, and through your dialogue and through what you notice and observe from their signs, from their pulse, their tongue, their color, their voice, etc., you realize that actually they're really anxious and they fly off the handle because they're so anxious. So the anxiety is showing up as some form of anger, but if you get underneath that and then treat the anxiety, they no longer need to fly off the handle. The flying off the handle just occurs when the level of anxiety is so great that they cannot manage it in that moment. And the flying off the handle is a sort of escape from the feeling of anxiety, a temporary escape from it. So we really have to look beyond the words of the child, but also beyond the words of the parent. I saw a teenager this week for the first time whose parent said, you know, they're lazy, I think they're depressed, they're really unhelpful, they don't join in with the family, they're staying in their room all the time, they're not wanting to go to school. And it became very clear to me that the reason that this boy was not leaving his room is because it made his anxiety spike. So realizing that and understanding that and being able to share that with his mother was, you know, a good sort of beginning to helping the boy, because if his mother then understood it for what it really was, she would be able to respond in a way that was more helpful to him, while we then have the time with the acupuncture to help him to feel less anxious. But anxiety often also shows up as a physical symptom. It may be that the child's not sleeping. It may be that they're getting headaches. It may be that they're not eating. It may be that they're tired all the time, or that they're having tummy aches. It can show up as almost anything. So what we need to take away from this is that anxiety is really a catch-all term that describes a multitude of different feeling states. And what we need to do is, again, to get beyond and underneath the words, and we need to make a Chinese medicine diagnosis according to the signs and symptoms of the child in front of us. And there are certain patterns of imbalance that crop up more commonly when we're treating anxious children and teens, and we're going to look at what they are. But it's not possible to say anxiety is always kidney deficiency or anxiety is always heat. It can show up in terms of patterns of imbalance as almost anything. So to give you a couple of examples, I treated a 7-year-old girl who was brought to the clinic for migraines. So she'd been having migraines since she started school at the age of 4, which is young to be starting to get migraines. And it just feels wrong for any 4-year-old to be having to deal with migraines. They were really full-on migraines. She was vomiting. She had to lie in bed for normally a day. But the migraines would always come on within an hour or two of her coming out of school. And that rang a little alarm bell for me when I was told that about what was going on at school. I diagnosed her as being a metal constitutional type, and I thought that her migraines were from liver yang rising, which was happening because metal wasn't controlling wood on the Ku cycle. But after a few sessions, what revealed itself was that this girl was really anxious during the day at school. It wasn't obvious to her teacher or even to her mum that she was anxious, but she had enormously high expectations of herself. If she wasn't getting full marks all the time, she felt bad about herself. So she put an enormous amount of pressure on herself. And actually, before she went to school every day, she would have to kind of steel herself in readiness for the day. So she was anything but relaxed. So once this became obvious, I just focus my treatment on helping her with this anxiety. And we're going to talk later on about the metal type anxiety, but it's very much focused around a sort of perfectionist attitude, having very high expectations of oneself. And through treating this girl's metal, she was able to relax a bit more in terms of her kind of performance. And it also helped to, it meant that wood was better under control when metal was stronger. And she became much more relaxed. And then the migraines gradually became less and less frequent until she no longer got them. So the anxiety was showing up as migraines. And then to give you an example the other way around, where something else was showing up as anxiety, I treated a 14-year-old girl who came in and sat down and said, I just feel anxious all the time. So I started talking to her about this and asked her to tell me about it. And she kept using words like irritated, frustrated, furious. I get really irritated with my younger brother. I get really frustrated at school because of this and that and the other.